Hi, I'm Tim Hart. Some of you may remember me as an editor and cartoonist for the Georgetown Law Weekly. In our day, that little Trotskyite student rag, which specialized in torturing deans at both ends of town. Anything to avoid studying. Full disclosure, as a student journalist, I was bent toward secret recordings early on, as evidenced by my lighting up the Attorney General and the FBI Director for their magnetic pursuit of Daniel Ellsberg and other undesirables, as the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers in June 1971, followed by the Washington Post in the fall. Getting after Mr. Mitchell again for being the plumber's sponsor and financial advisor, according to Woodward and Bernstein. Satirizing Mitchell's successor's promises to investigate the break-in at his earliest opportunity, after the election. Questioning what was really behind head plumber E. Howard Hunt's guilty plea, and showing no sympathy for the president's broad claims of executive privilege as the Senate Select Committee sharpened its tools for its May 1973 kickoff of public hearings. Speaking of the Senate Watergate Committee, we all know that our own Professor Sam Dash joined the team in the spring of our third year, and Bill can speak in detail about that. All I know is that the Law Weekly received a copy of bribe-resistant plumber James McCord's letter, shoved under our door in the dead of night, before the Washington Post published it. The Criminal Law and Procedures Institute's office was right next door, so there are at least 3 good suspects. Shout out to Mark Gittenstein, class of '72, and Sam Ervin's counsel, who co-authored the resolution creating the Select Committee. Things might have turned out a lot differently had James O. Eastland of Mississippi and Strom Thurmond of South Carolina steered the ship in the Senate Judiciary Committee instead of Senators Ervin and Baker. Georgetown Today's July 1973 issue, Georgetown and the Watergate, highlighted players with Hoya-Loya connections. Besides Sam Dash, there were John W. Dean III, General Alexander Sinister Forces Haig, Senator Joe Montoya, a Select Committee member, and of course, Judge John J. Sirica. Sam picked 6 students to help him out: Mark Byros, Bill Hemsley, and Bob McNamara from our class, and students Mike Frisch, Patrick O'Leary, and Gail Waller. A half a dozen GULC alums were representing Watergate-implicated figures at that point, and Senator Hubert H. Humphrey spoke to us about Watergate excesses at our graduation. Fun footnote: Frank Wills, the private security guard who discovered and reported the break-in, was hired 3 years later as a security guard by Georgetown. Judge Sirica presided at Professor Jason Newman's and classmate Ed O'Brien's street law program's final moot court trial, here April 30th. Of his experience, he said, "It's more difficult to try this case than the Watergate case, because this one is make-believe." In second year, Lenore Cameron and I team-taught street law at Dunbar High School. It was a transformative experience for me. Those kids weren't shy about asking the one question we law students were counseled to avoid: why? In the spirit of the season, I'll use the metaphor of Major League Baseball to pose and answer this question. How did the 1974 Congressional Cubs pull it off? Well, first, thank the groundskeepers. Through 1973, the Senate Select Committee, Judge Sirica, the D.C. Grand Jury, and Uncle Walter Cronkite plowed, seeded, and groomed the field. Next, Great pitching. Within a week of the Saturday Night Massacre on October 20th, 1973, 42 House members introduced 11 impeachment resolutions to be referred to its Committee on the Judiciary. One of the central reasons the House Judiciary Committee acquitted itself so well was improving on the Senate Select Committee's example. Chairman Peter Rodino and Ranking Minority Member Edward Hutchinson decided jointly to employ a bipartisan, independent staff to prosecute the inquiry. Named as majority and minority counsel in early 1974 were John M. Doerr and Albert E. Jenner, Jr. John Doerr was a Republican hired by the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division in 1960 and asked to stay on by the Kennedy administration. As first assistant there, he distinguished himself in a variety of ways. In 1962, he, FBI Special Agent James McShane, and federal marshals escorted James Meredith to his first day of classes at Ole Miss. In 1963, he calmed an angry mob after the assassination of Medgar Evers outside Evers' home. In 1967, he supervised the successful prosecution of the Klan killers of civil rights activists Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. Burt Jenner was an Illinois Eisenhower Republican in private practice who staffed and eventually directed to conclusion and report the Warren Commission, which investigated President Kennedy's assassination. After the King and Kennedy assassinations in 1968, he was appointed again by President Johnson to the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence, chaired by Milton Eisenhower. Its findings and recommendations could have been written yesterday. Quote, "To be a young, poor male, to be undereducated and without means of escape from an oppressive urban environment, to want what the society claims is available, but mostly to others, to see around oneself illegitimate and often violent methods being used to achieve material success, and to observe others using these means with impunity. All this is to be burdened with an enormous set of influences that pull many toward crime and delinquency. To be also a Negro, Mexican, or Puerto Rican American and subject to discrimination and segregation adds considerably to the pull of these other criminogenic forces." Close quote. The impeachment inquiry staff, at full strength, 43 counsel, 4 investigators, and 54 support staff, were drawn from a broad cross-section of backgrounds and disciplines, including U.S. attorneys' offices and the Justice Department's Criminal Division. At least 2 went on to careers in elected public service, and in fact, stood for national election a couple years ago. Here's the committee's impeachment inquiry class picture. The inquiry staff was sequestered and worked away in the Capitol Annex, an old hotel across the street from the Rayburn Building, which is where the committee had its hearing room and offices. To Jenner's and Doerr's left is Senior Associate Co-Counsel Bernie Nussbaum, who went on to become counsel to the president in the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. I came aboard in March 1974. Check out those lapels. You could land an F-22 on those suckers. I was hired as a majority staff counsel to the Subcommittee on Crime. The subcommittee was chaired by Detroit Democratic Representative John Conyers, number 13 of 20 on the original White House enemies list. He was one of 6 committee members, along with Representatives Edwards, Eilberg, Walde, Drinan, and Holtzman, who were the strongest proponents of earliest public hearings and articles of impeachment for each of the 6 areas of possible violations under study. Things were already beyond interesting. On February 6th, the House had voted 410-4 to formally authorize the committee to proceed with its inquiry. On February 22nd, the committee unanimously adopted and published 2 documents prepared by impeachment inquiry staff: Constitutional Grounds for Presidential Impeachment and Procedures for Handling Impeachment Inquiry Material. The former concluded that, quote, limiting impeachable conduct to criminal offenses would be incompatible with the evidence concerning the constitutional meaning of the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, and would frustrate the purpose that the framers intended for impeachment, close quotes. The latter emphasized the need to protect sensitive material. On February 25th, Special Counsel Doerr sent to Presidential Counsel James St. Clair a request for, quote, specific evidence of specific facts of specific relevance to its inquiry, close quotes, including 42 tapes of presidential conversations related to the water break-in occurring from September 15th, 1972 through April 30th, 1973. On March 1st, my first day, the D.C. grand jury delivered their secret recommendation to Judge Sirica, along with a sealed briefcase intended for the committee. They named the president an unindicted co-conspirator. Needless to say, from then on, we permanent committee counsel spent almost all of our time on only one issue, pretty much through December. As you might expect, things were contentious well before the televised public debates. For weeks into early April, the majority and minority fenced behind closed doors over whether to formally subpoena the tapes, both together and in party caucuses. In one such meeting, the Democrats were having trouble getting over the threshold. Jack Brooks, third-ranking Democrat, a close LBJ ally with a reputation for going through staff like Kleenex, lost his patience. I'm going to say now what I'd say to the young ladies I used to date when we got to the doorstep. Fun's fun, honey, but we can't laugh all night. His colleagues found their courage. The team's all-star short reliever was Dick Cates. By late June, partisan leaking from outside the impeachment staff was increasing because the committee, even in the face of presidential stonewalling, was in possession of transcripts from the grand jury and the special prosecutor. Cates, a brilliant, raw-boned Wisconsin litigator, had been hired initially as senior co-counsel, but was displaced by Doerr. He lacked the deference, diplomacy, and management skills to herd 42 other lawyers. Impeachment staff was concerned because the Democrats were all over the place. Under inhuman stress and cowed by the sheer volume of information, they just didn't know the case 3 weeks before the trial. Dick was summoned back to Washington and organized late evening briefings for members in small groups and by issue through the first 2 weeks of July. Some of us on the permanent staff were asked to assist in these briefings. In one I attended with a half-dozen Democrats, Cates delivered the facts of the case, and the members were spellbound. John Seiberling of Ohio, a corporate lawyer and heir to the Seiberling tire fortune, threw his glasses onto the table. "If I had a client in this much trouble, I'd tell him to settle." From July 9th through 17th, the committee heard and questioned former administration officials, including John N. Mitchell, the former Attorney General. When he came into the back corridor to be shown in, I was close enough to touch him. I flashed on him standing on his office balcony on May 4th, 1971, like Francisco Franco, watching the D.C. police haul away 300 to 400 kids demonstrating below to a makeshift internment camp at RFK Stadium. Over those 4 days of May Day, more than 13,000 demonstrators were arrested, the largest mass arrest in American history. I also remember that our criminal justice clinic and student volunteers worked overtime to get kids released. For a second, I imagined my hands around his throat. Things got real after witnesses were heard in executive session. July 16th, the President communicated his refusal to comply with the committee's 4 June 25th subpoenas. That same day, the Republicans instructed minority staff to, quote, prepare an assessment of the statements of information presented by the impeachment inquiry staff to the committee during the course of its inquiry, including factual arguments both for and against the sufficiency of the evidence as to grounds for impeachment of the president, close quotes. The resultant inference memo became the basis for the minority's defense of the president against impeachment. July 18, Presidential Special Counsel St. Clair presented his written brief and final oral argument on behalf of the president, urging the committee to find that it lacked sufficient evidence to justify a recommendation of impeachment due to a, quote, complete absence of any conclusive evidence demonstrating presidential wrongdoing sufficient to justify the grave action of impeachment, close quotes. Included in his presentation was the brief edited transcript of a March 22, 1973 conversation between the president and H.R. Haldeman. The tape of the conversation, which lasted approximately 90 minutes, on the morning of the day after the payment of $75,000 to Hunt, had been subpoenaed by the committee May 30th. The president had refused to furnish it July 10th. July 19th, Special Counsel Doar presented a 306-page summary of the impeachment inquiry staff's analyzed evidence, saying, quote, the critical question this committee must decide is whether the president was duped by his closest political associates or whether they were in fact carrying out his policies and decisions. This question must be decided one way or the other, close quotes. Special Minority Counsel Jenner agreed with Doar's basic point that the committee must recommend impeachment to ultimately resolve that question. The minority members stripped Jenner of his title on the spot, and the majority named Jenner Associate Counsel to Doar. July 22nd, Samuel A. Garrison III, who replaced Special Minority Counsel Jenner, presented arguments against impeachment to the full committee. He urged the members to act as prudent prosecutors and not to recommend impeachment without a legal basis sustainable in a Senate trial. He cautioned against using inferences drawn from suspicion, for example, about the content of the material the president had refused to provide to the committee despite its subpoenas, as a basis for recommending impeachment. After concluding that an official had engaged in conduct for which he could properly be impeached, said Garrison, that members should also consider whether the best interests of the country would be better served by his removal or continuance in office. After the public hearing schedule was announced, the media moved from the committees and members' offices, hallways, or anywhere else they could fish for information, to the main meeting room. Here, Joe Wood, John Doar, Hillary Rodham, and Bernie Nussbaum fenced with ABC's Sam Donaldson. It was said of Nixon fixer Charles Colson that he would run over his grandmother to protect the president. Other reporters told me that Sam Donaldson would do much worse to his own grandmother to get the story. In my own experience, my favorite sports writer was Daniel Shore of CBS News, a gentleman and professional of unimpeachable integrity. On June 27, 1973, John Dean revealed the White House enemies list for the first time. Shore grabbed a copy to read on the air, live, and discovered his was the 17th of 20 names on the list. In 1988, he struck up a friendship with rock legend Frank the Oracle Zappa over getting out the youth vote. It was a partnership that deepened and endured until his death in 2010. Another favorite scribe was Roger Mudd, then at CBS. One evening, the cops had cleared the room, and I wangled him back in so he could do his on-air stand-up there. He said he owed me a drink. I never collected, but I did learn that he was a descendant of Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, the Virginia physician who treated John Wilkes Booth's broken leg after he had assassinated President Lincoln. Dr. Mudd did 4 years in prison and was pardoned, but despite a long campaign by his descendants, his conviction was never expunged. Once opened, the committee's hearings were standing room only. Hey kids, check out the size of those cameras. You'll never curse your smartphone again. All credit goes to the team's two unassuming managers, Chairman Peter Rodino, Democrat of New Jersey, and Illinois Robert McClory for the Republicans. Technically, Edward Hutchinson of Michigan was the committee's ranking minority member and therefore their top dog, but he proved to be an immovable Nixon partisan until Nixon resigned. Rodino was in his 12th House term, a product of Newark, New Jersey's ward politics, which involved navigating one's way around the mob, whom he referred to cryptically as them. He lived his own version of The Sopranos, but earlier and on the other side. He had labored for 2 decades under Chairman Manny Seller from New York, a force of nature for 48 years in championing immigration and civil rights. There was a lot of whispering behind hands that Rodino wasn't up to the job, even under the best circumstances. Managing Democrats was like herding cats through a fish market. Quiet but steely when required, steady and moral, he proved all his doubters wrong. He never surrendered under pressure, but behind closed doors after the first impeachment vote, he called his wife and they wept together. After Watergate, one of my Republican counsel friends vacationed in Italy. He returned to report that every shop and bistro had 2 images in their windows, the Pope and Peter Rodino. Bob McClory grew up in a small town of less than 2,000 people, well west of Chicago. Born ahead of the greatest generation and ramrod straight, he was emblematic of most Eisenhower Republicans, with empathy for and a sense of duty toward the less fortunate. As a young lawyer, he and his wife took in 2 Japanese-American children through a faith-based organization to spare them the horror of internment. After the war, they adopted them. He voted against Article 1, but led a bipartisan group to refashion Article 2 into a specific indictment of the president for failing to respect his constitutional oath, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and quoting James Madison all the way. He also voted for Article 3. After the public debate and the March 23, 1972 tape was delivered, The Smoking Gun, he issued a press release on August 6, calling on the president to resign. That same day, he met with Rodino and Democrat Don Edwards, who told him they and the House leadership would drop impeachment and criminal prosecution of the president if he resigned. Bob called Bill Timmons, Nixon's legislative liaison, with that offer. The president announced his resignation less than 2 days later. I got to know Bob much better after that, because he was the ranking member of the subcommittee I staffed. I am grateful to have known such a remarkable human being. My nominees for most valuable players, top and bottom of the order, all in order of seniority. For the Democrats, for their defense. 3 Southerners, James Mann of South Carolina, Walter Flowers of Alabama, and Ray Thornton of Arkansas. All 3 represented districts that President Nixon had carried by over 70% in 1972. They had nothing to gain politically by confronting him. They argued, counseled, and drafted behind the scenes, and anguished in public to both their constituents and the nation. Flowers blunted the committee's Nixon's partisans' attacks on Article 2 for lacking specificity by moving to strike specific sections, thereby authorizing his colleagues to recite specific offenses and evidence into the record, then voting present as his motions were defeated. Paul Sarbanes, a Greek-American Baltimorean of self-deprecating wit and intellect, shepherded Article 2's Sarbanes Substitute Amendment, drafted in concert with Republican members. Barbara Jordan, the first black state senator elected to the Texas legislature, and an LBJ protege, also the committee's Rookie of the Year. In her thunderous voice with its patrician inflection, which many of her conservative colleagues coveted, she announced in opening debate both her race's and gender's long-delayed arrival to we the people, and the Constitution's basis for calling this president to account. I hung with her once after the room was open to the media gaggle. A reporter asked her if she considered herself a politician. Without hesitation, "No." Perplexed, he asked why not. "I'm a professional politician. There's a difference. Everyone is a politician." I can't put a number on how many times I've used that to remind fellow citizens that it's up to all of us. For the Republicans, these 5 earned 110% awards for their spine-stiffening 6 votes on Article 1 and their contributions to the other 2. Tom Railsback of suburban Chicago, the first doubtful voice heard on his side in public debate. Hamilton Fish Jr. of upstate New York, who continued his family's 4 generations of dignified service in the House and elsewhere. His great-grandfather served Abraham Lincoln as Secretary of State. Larry Hogan, a former FBI agent who became Maryland's governor, announcing his intention to confront the president well before he needed to. M. Caldwell Butler, an acerbic conservative from southwestern Virginia, known affectionately to staff as Scaldwell, who took his Thomas Jefferson more seriously than most, and told the president in no uncertain terms how betrayed he was by his conduct unbecoming the Constitution. He also called his wife at home after the first vote and tearfully asked for her reassurance. Basketball Bill Cohen from Maine, who spoke above the cacophony of his partisan colleagues and blunted it with his contributions to all 3 successful articles. Such were his skills that he went on to exemplary service in the Senate and as Secretary of Defense. Rookie of the Year honorable mention goes to Elizabeth Holtzman. Though included among the half-dozen most partisan Democratic committee members, she was also the second female freshman and arrived having ended the 48-year tenure of Manny Seller, the committee's longtime chairman and a House legend. She encountered no small amount of resentment, and perhaps fear, from the party patriarchy, but she acquitted herself well. My love of the game citation goes to every committee member who met a challenge that shook them to their foundations by giving lie to what they knew and believed. Two outstanding examples from each side. Jim Mann, who expressed his doubts, principles, and conflict between duty to constituents and country with equal dignity in his soft, mellifluous drawl. I imagined a gentlemanly Southern delegate to our long-ago Constitutional Convention, without the slavery. He also took regular deliveries of the best Carolina barbecue I've ever tasted. We staff would appear at his office door those Fridays, mewling like starving cats. And Chuck Wiggins hated being typified as Nixon's biggest defender because to him, an Orange County, California lawyer, the focus remained on the words and spirit of the Constitution and its laws. His intellect and integrity wouldn't allow him to be either petty or indulgent in debate. After the president revealed the extent of his wrongdoing, he led the other 10 members who had voted against impeachment to the House radio and television studio to announce their collective change in position. And he broke down. He went on to serve with distinction on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. When President Nixon announced his resignation, the House and Senate had already taken action to suspend their rules to permit impeachment and trial proceedings to be televised. On August 20th, the House fulfilled their leader's bargain to accept the committee's report, effectively ending any further action on impeachment. President Ford's unconditional pardon of Richard Nixon on September 8th both rekindled passions for requiring some kind of accountability of the president and sealed the ex-vice president's political fate. The committee called on him to explain his decision on October 14th, making him the first sitting president to testify before the Congress since Abraham Lincoln. The new president needed a vice president, so the 25th Amendment was invoked again to require the House and Senate to consider and ratify the nomination and appointment of former New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller. Rockefeller had been a liberal candidate in 1968, defeated by Nixon in their party's presidential primaries. The committee held 9 days of contentious hearings in late November and early December, again fed by remaining rancor over the pardon, before recommending Rockefeller's ratification. It was the only time in our nation's history that neither the president nor vice president had been elected by the people. My favorite valedictory for the whole mess is The Friends of Richard Nixon by George V. Higgins. It expanded on a series of articles he'd written the year before to Harper's Magazine during all the action, and was published in early 1975. He was an assistant U.S. attorney under Elliot Richardson in Massachusetts in 1973, before Richardson was summoned to Washington and massacred. In 1972, Higgins had published The Friends of Eddie Coyle, a novel about South Boston's Irish mob, which was made into a movie starring Robert Mitchum the next year. Unlike Eddie's friends, Higgins found that Richard Nixon's Confederates lacked the moral sensibility and self-discipline typical of small-time mobsters. He also applied a prosecutor's skills to the tapes to illustrate what an accomplished and pernicious liar the president really was. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a videotape is worth a library. 7 months of stressful study and weeks of rancorous private and public debate later, watch the committee's 3.5-minute roll call vote on the amendments to Article 1. See in their faces and hear in their voices the impact of being compelled to do the right thing with the whole world watching.